Durant, Mississippi. If you're from Durant, Mississippi, you don't say Durant, Mississippi, you say Durant. And that's where I grew up. That's the dividing line whether you actually live there or not. If you say Durant, you didn't grow up there. My father owned a couple of Piggly Wiggly grocery stores in Durant and Lexington. And I grew up bagging groceries in the late 70s and 80s. And I thought about it this morning. I would not be shocked if I could rewind the tape and find out that I actually bagged Hazel's groceries without knowing who Hazel was. I do remember as a teenager growing up, seeing her newspaper on the stands in front of my dad's stores, knowing absolutely nothing about her. Just remember thinking the paper didn't look like it was of great quality, and that's because she was, by 1980, she was on the downward slope. But I was, as Craig said, I was a Baptist minister for 15 years and went on a different career path. And in the early 2000s, I went to Mississippi State and worked on a master's degree in history. And I was in a class called historiography, where you learn how to research and write a term paper. And I had to go to the library and find a topic and write an original paper based on primary sources. And I walked into the special collections room at Mississippi State and thought, what the heck am I going to write on? And I saw the Hazel Brannon Smith collection. And I thought, what the heck is she doing here? That's the old lady from Lexington that I used to see her paper. And as I began to research who she was, my jaw kept dropping further and further. And this woman won a Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing in 1964. I had never heard of that. She had a cross burned in her yard in 1960 in Lexington. I'd never heard of that. So as I began to delve into her life, it led me into studying African American history in Holmes County, and I ended up writing a master's thesis on the civil rights movement in Holmes County, and eventually led to writing of this book, Hazel Brannon Smith, The Female Crusading Scalawag. My book is a biography, and I cover her career from when she was born in northern Alabama in 1914 to her graduating from the University of Alabama in 1935 to her coming to Durant in the middle of the Depression in 1936 and charming a banker. Now think about this, if you're old enough to at least know what the Depression was. Some of you look like you may have lived through the Depression. My mother is 87, so she lived through the Depression. She came to Durant in 1936 and charmed a banker into giving her $3,000 to buy a newspaper in the middle of the Depression that will tell you what kind of personality she was. She was a 5'9" former beauty queen from the University of Alabama. To backtrack, she as a teenager worked for the Etowah Observer and was so successful at selling ads on commission, they put her on salary. She graduated from high school a year early. Her parents thought she was too young to go to college, but she eventually matriculated to the University of Alabama, where she gained a degree in journalism. And from a very young period of her life, she was a trendsetter. She told her family, I don't want to give dictation, or I don't want to have to take dictation, I want to give dictation. And I don't want to write for a newspaper, I want to own a newspaper. So she was not only, in many ways, a pioneer in white journalism in Mississippi, standing for the civil rights movement, she was also a pioneer for women in the journalistic profession. So this is her column. When she came to Mississippi, she first had a column called Knock Knock. She started in 1937, didn't work too well. She eventually settled on the very appropriate moniker Through Hazel Eyes, Hazel being her name, Hazel the color of her eyes. And this, if you bought the Durant News or the Lexington Advertiser or the North Side Reporter or the Banner Outlook, which are two other papers that she owned at different times in her career, you would have seen this in the upper left-hand column of the newspaper. And there she took the opportunity for 50 years to tell you what she thought about the state of Durant, Lexington, Mississippi, and the United States. She came out of this progressive background of the 1920s where she believed that the newspaper was for the benefit of the community. It was, she will say over and over and over in 50 years, she is writing for the health of the community. What did that mean? That meant that if she thought something was good for the community, she wrote about it. So if a hosiery mill was needed in Lexington, she beat the band, let's go, encourage these people to come to Lexington and put a hosiery mill there. She makes a reputation in the 1940s by taking on bootleg alcohol and bootleggers and corrupt officials. That's where she first came to national attention. Now, from everything I've read about her, she liked to drink, so she wasn't a teetotaler. And if you had a career like she had, you probably drank a lot with all of the stuff she had to endure. But she would say in her papers throughout the 40s and early 50s, nobody has any problems with a bootlegger back out in the country. You go out there and you get moonshine, and you get whiskey from Memphis or from Louisiana. You got to keep in mind, if you didn't know this, that prohibition laws remained on the books in Mississippi until 1966. All right? I read a Newsweek article once that said the second highest paid public official in the United States was William Winter, the state tax collector from Mississippi, and he made his money on the black market tax. You know what that was? That was a tax on an illegal substance, which was alcohol. That's Mississippi for you. So she began to write editorials at the end of World War II where she said, look, if Mississippians want to drink, the natural progression would be that Mississippians should what? Get rid of the prohibition laws. On the other hand, if prohibition is the law and all the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians want to keep alcohol out of people's hands, then make sure the sheriffs and the judges and the district attorneys prosecute these lawbreakers. In my research, I found that one bootlegger in Holmes County made $1 million in 1943. I don't know how many millions of dollars that would be today. By simply going to Memphis and bringing in alcohol. It wasn't the drinking, though, that bothered her as much as the atmosphere that bootleg liquor promoted. It promoted lawlessness. It promoted organized crime coming into the county. Durant at one time, see it comes out of Durant, in escape. Durant at one time had 20 plus nightclubs all around the town. My father was a highway patrolman sent to Durant in 1957, and my North Mississippi relative said, don't go there, that's little Chicago, you'll get killed. Okay? James Meredith, who we all know, integrated Ole Miss in 1962, wrote in his book, 3 Years in Mississippi, that if you were in a County where it was bone dry and you wanted to have fun, you went across the Big Black River to the nightclubs and the juke joints in Durant or outside of Lexington or Chula or Goodman and places like that. So she earned a national reputation taking on sheriffs that were on the take, judges that were not prosecuting bootleggers and things of that nature. I've got a few pictures to give you an idea of what she looked like. This is her from 1940. Can y'all see? My big head's on. This is her from 1940 when she was a delegate to the Democratic Convention. And this is Damon Runyon, who was a well-known syndicated columnist at the time. Notice he called her, Durant editor says Runyon is the prettiest party delegate. At this time, she would have been, this is 1940, so she would have been 26 years old. And she was already letting it be known that she was setting her sights on the Lexington Advertiser, which was the biggest newspaper in the county. Okay? This is what was amazing about her. She comes to Durant in 1936 with a $3,000 loan. The Durant News was called the Durant Excuse because it had 3 editors in 18 months. It was the kind of thing that when you open your box today and you pull out some circular, what do you do with it? I'm an old Baptist preacher, folks, so I like people responding. So, what do you do with it? You throw it away. You put it in what my mother calls the round file. You know, the round garbage can at the door. Well, people used to take the Durant News and throw it in the garbage can. Well, she began to pepper people as soon as they got off the train, from Illinois Central Link to New Orleans to Chicago. Do you have any news? And within 5 to 6 years, she had paid off the $3,000 loan, and because of World War II, the owner of the Lexington Advertiser went into the Navy, and she purchased that. Okay? So think about this. In less than a decade, this young woman, in a time when women were supposed to do what? Get married, stay home, have babies, and hush. You know, that was it. Well, by 1946-47, she is making, as my granddaddy used to say, from Pontotoc, Mississippi, she was making money hand over fist. She was driving convertible Cadillacs. She was carrying Gucci handbags. She was wearing Lily Datch hats. I had to look up who Lily Datch was. Lily Datch made hats about this wide. Okay? I grew up in Mississippi, so in Durant, my mother and father knew Hazel, you know, acquaintances. My mother used to say you didn't want to sit behind Hazel in church. Because if you did, you couldn't see the preacher. Because her hat was out to here. Okay? Let me show you a picture here. You think I was kidding, don't you? Notice this picture. She is at the Mississippi Press Association. All of these men are around the table are newspaper editors. They look like a barrel full of laughs, don't they? They're all serious. The wives are very plain for the style. And here's Hazel wearing these huge hats. I interviewed Bill Miner a long time ago, that's his memory, and he told me that Hazel would walk down the steps at like the Mississippi Press Association in Biloxi, and all the male editors are just sitting there going, "Oh my God," because they were just in love with her beauty. But the thing was, she had this belief that a newspaper was supposed to be of service to the community. So while some people were thinking you need to be quiet about bootlegging and about alcohol, she rallied the citizens of Holmes County to try to get rid of the bootlegging. A sheriff was elected, I believe, in 1948, and began to clean up the county, and she took a lot of credit for that she had helped promote this campaign of law and order. At the same time, Hazel Brannon Smith, by this time she got married in 1950 to Walter Smith. She met him on a cruise. He was a purser on a cruise ship, and she brought back this Yankee from Philadelphia. Now think about that, to down home Mississippi. So here she is, on the cutting edge of everything, and people are like, "You are so different from us." And then she brings on this Yankee from Philadelphia, and they're living, as my granddaddy would say, high on the hog, right? Convertible Cadillacs, all these types of things. While she was a progressive when it came to fighting corruption and things of that nature, she held the same racist attitudes that any other white Mississippian held at the time. I'm just paraphrasing from the book some of the things she said. She wrote an editorial in 1943 where she basically said the South is white man's country and everybody knows it. She castigated Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor for their mild attempts at civil rights. She fully supported Fielding Wright and Strom Thurmond and the Democratic Party in 1948. She basically said that the Democratic Party had abandoned white Southerners, and the National Democratic Party under Truman was going to promote civil rights. You were going to have a race revolution in Mississippi and the South. So if you had interviewed her 1939, 1949, 1956, as a reporter did from a northern newspaper, she held the conventional, what we would call racist attitudes that most Mississippians had during this period. Okay? So, this is what she looked like in 1957 when she's 43 years old. In the book, I try to weave these two themes of fighting alcohol and promoting Jim Crow segregation through the first 900 pages of the book. She was, as I said, progressive in one way and not progressive when it came to race. These two themes of illegal alcohol and race clash in 1954. Okay? What happens on May 17, 1954?
Brown versus the Board.
Brown versus Board of Education is handed down. Okay? She wrote an editorial where she basically said she didn't like it. She thought the federal government was overstepping its bounds. She thought, like most of her peers, that white Southerners could handle the race problem. We don't need any of these Yankee outside agitators. That was the most normal phrase, outside agitators. But she said, if it's the law, we'll have to obey it. It's very different from her peers, but she said it's going to be way down the road. She said if white Southerners will simply work to make black schools better and sympathetic blacks and sympathetic whites come together, then we can solve the race problem. What she was showing was an ignorance of the conditions that African Americans were undergoing. A part of my book is not simply to tell her story, but to tell the story of African Americans in Mississippi. Now, John Dittmer and Charles Payne have done a much better job of that, of course, because their entire 300 or 400 page books focus exclusively on African Americans. But all through my book, in dealing with her, I contrast her position of privilege with the average grinding daily indignities that African Americans had to face living in Holmes County. So while she's driving convertible Cadillacs, people like Chalmers Archer Jr., who wrote a memoir growing up in Holmes County, said he was splitting pain from being beaten by a police officer for not simply getting off the sidewalk quick enough in front of a white woman as he walked through downtown Lexington. So she was oblivious to the conditions that African Americans were going through. In 54, when the Brown decision came out, almost immediately an organization was formed within a month in Mississippi. Okay, you're on a game show and it's $1 million. What was that? The White Citizens Council. Okay? Hottie Carter Jr. called it the white collar or uptown Klan. Okay? These were not no front teeth Billy Bubbas that drove pickup trucks and said yeehaw all the time. That's my whole family trio. These were the doctors, the lawyers, the preachers, the mercantile owners, and they banded together first in Indianola, Mississippi, and they basically said, we're going to stop African Americans from promoting civil rights through economic intimidation, if need be, covert violence, whatever we can do, we're going to stop any kind of equality for African Americans coming to Mississippi. The second chapter of the White Citizens Council was formed in Holmes County, where Hazel lived. She wrote about it obliquely. At the time, she wrote about it more clearly a decade later. She said that one of the leading citizens of Lexington, and probably one of her friends, one of the people she probably went to Christmas parties with, things of that nature. I found a whole list in her collection of people she sent Christmas cards to in 1946. And as I go through it, I'm like, yep. And I find all these people who 10 years later are calling her a scalawag and opposing her. So one of her peers comes to her in the summer of 1954 and basically says, we want you to get on board with our campaign to stop African Americans. And she's like, well, what are you going to do? They basically tell her we're going to use economic intimidation, we're going to use fear tactics, whatever. And she said, well, I don't think that's a good thing. Well, that immediately put her on a path where she and her white peers in the white establishment basically end up in two different universes within 5 years. Okay? Because in July of 1954, the sheriff of Holmes County, Richard Byrd, was driving in front of a juke joint in Chula, Mississippi, and some young black men were out in front of the juke joint, and supposedly they were what he called whooping. I don't know exactly what they were yelling or something. And he backs up and stops, and he physically assaults one of these young black men. He tells the young black man to get going, and the young black man runs, and Byrd pulls out his pistol and shoots the young black man in the back of his thigh. He survives. Hazel gets word of this. She had already been lambasting him for 1.5 years by saying stuff like, all of these bootleggers that disappeared for a while have reappeared, so either you're too dumb to do your job or you're on the take. She just put that in the editorials. You're either dumb or you're just on the take. So she had been, criticizing him for months. Well, as soon as she hears about the shooting of this young black man, she said it is not the job of law officials to take matters into their hands and just willy-nilly shoot people down the streets. So she said, you are not fit to hold the badge. I guarantee you, I wasn't there, never spoke to her, but I guarantee you she probably thought that her white peers were going to support her, like they had supported her in the 40s in this almost decade-long fight over bootleg alcohol. But she did not realize that the world had turned. She didn't realize that the context had changed. If she would have asked her readers, should I fight against bootleg alcohol in 1949? They would say, yes. Should I fight against bootleg alcohol and corrupt sheriffs who shoot black people in 1954? It was a no. Because what they wanted her to do was to circle the wagons and promote white supremacy. And keep in mind, she was just as entrenched in her belief in black inferiority than anybody else in the county. You can read her editorials and see it. She's very condescending, very paternalistic toward African Americans. She would say things like, we know our black citizens are working as hard as they can to get to the level that they are at, which is, if you read between the lines, black people aren't on white people's level, but we know they're trying, that kind of thing. But once she wrote the editorial criticizing Richard Byrd, he turned around and sued her for libel. The citizens of Holmes County, in a jury trial, found her guilty for $10,000. It's eventually overturned by the state Supreme Court because she basically just reported what happened. But from that point on, she and her white peers drastically divided. Okay? By 1956, her husband, who was the administrator of the Holmes County Hospital, is fired because his wife was too controversial. By 1958, her former friends formed the Holmes County Herald for one specific purpose, well, two specific purposes. One, to promote Jim Crow ideology, and two, to break her economic spine. And they began to take away all of her advertising. She begins to write at the end of 1959, 1960, and well into the 70s, well, we lost money again this year. All of a sudden, the Cadillacs disappear, and she starts driving Ramblers. Okay? I'm too young to know exactly what a Rambler was. How it's, maybe, I guess in modern technology, she went from driving an Escalade to a Pinto. But a more economical car. By 1958 and 59, she comes to the attention of Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers writes Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, the head of the NAACP, saying that we need to support her. She, by 1959, is in need of printing jobs. I mean, that's how a newspaper makes money. You print other people's documents and you sell advertising. She began to print black church catalogs and things of that nature, and NAACP newspapers. And people began to call her an integrationist. She will say over and over from the late 50s until the early 60s, I am not an integrationist. But what's interesting, and I make this clear in the book, I think she was trying to have her cake and eat it too. Does that make sense? Her conscience would not allow her journalistic integrity would not allow her to not print what she thought was the news. Okay? Let me back up real quick. 1937, she goes out with the leading, young citizens of Durant and Lexington. She says later to the Clarion Ledger in 1986, she said, honey, I had the best looking guy in Lexington and the best looking guy in Durant. The problem wasn't good to have both. She's played the field, but in 1937, there was a BD epidemic in the county, mostly in the poor sections of the county, poor whites and poor blacks. And she put on the front page in 1937, we need a BD clinic in Holmes County. And her boyfriend told her, looking down his nose, a lady doesn't speak of such things. And this 23-year-old young woman fires back, I ain't no lady, I'm a newspaper woman. Meaning, it's news, I've got to print it. So by the late 50s, even though maybe in her heart of hearts, she still saw a difference between blacks and whites, her journalistic integrity would not allow her to not write. Blacks are being murdered, Jewish synagogues are being blown up in Jacksonville, Florida. I mentioned that in the book, things of that nature. And she began to say, hey, on the one hand, I'm with the White Citizens Council that race ought to be separate, but on the other hand, you people are oppressing me. You're taking away my freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of association, and that's like Hitler and Stalin, and that's thoroughly un-American. Okay? Now, by 1958, when the Holmes County Herald is put into business for the specific purpose of putting her out of business, if she had foresight in the future when it was going to cost her, she probably would have done better to lock up the shop, sell the paper, and move on to greener pastures. Other Mississippi editors, like Ira Hartke, was a very brave man, but when they shot out his windows on the Gulf Coast in his newspaper in 1963, he basically said, the hell with Mississippi, sold his paper for $1 million and hightailed out of the state. Who could blame him? Hazel basically said, I'm here, and I'm going to print your obituaries one day, and I'm not going anywhere. Well, what it did was it cost her her reputation, it cost her her fortune, it cost her 2 different newspapers. The North Side Reporter was firebombed in 1964. The Lexington Advertiser was heavily damaged in 1967 from arson. And she said, I would like to think that my fellow Lexingtonians would set my building on fire, but what other choice do I have, because it's clearly arson. By 1960, she is sitting with her husband Walter in their house on Halloween 1960, and she hears what she thinks are firecrackers, and she looks down her driveway and she thinks her magnolia tree is on fire, but that's not what it was. What was it? A burning cross. I think if that had been me, I would have gone inside, boo-hooed and cried and said, oh, woe is me, and run for the exit. She ran down the driveway, drove these teenagers off, ripped the tag off the back of the car, and did some research and found out that it was a car belonging to one of the leading citizens of Lexington. And she began to say, it's a terrible thing when teenagers are taking in the hatred of their parents and manifesting itself in burning a cross, which was sent as messages to blacks and whites that you are beyond the pale, you are worth nothing as a person, it's used to terrorize you. And she basically said in her editorials, they burned a cross in my yard. If you don't do something about it soon in Holmes County, Mississippi, your yard may be next. So she, by 1960, 1961, began to move further and further away from her white peers and became an ally of the Civil Rights Movement. By 1961, she is writing editorials where basically she says things like, it's no shocker that black people are living in poverty and black people are suffering because we as white Mississippians have put them there through unjust laws and murder and violence and intimidation. So once she got on the wrong side of Jim Crow, she began to see her fight for freedom of speech as a part of the greater fight for civil rights in Mississippi. If you read her editorials from 1962 onward, she is every Thursday when the paper came out calling for Mississippi to repent, calling for Mississippi to be introspective, calling for Mississippi, for God's sake, do you see we're destroying ourselves? We're destroying white people. We're destroying our American values of democracy and freedoms that we take so dear. And she said we live in a fascist state in Mississippi. It gets so bad for her that in 1962, Sovereignty Commission investigators, how many of you don't know what the Sovereignty Commission is? The Sovereignty Commission was an organization started by the Mississippi government in 1956. It was basically a publicity arm of the state government until Ross Barnett became governor in 1960. Once Ross Barnett became governor in 1960, the Sovereignty Commission for the next 12 to 13 years basically became the Mississippi version of the FBI. But not what the FBI is supposed to do, which is prosecute lawbreakers. The Sovereignty Commission kept thousands and thousands and thousands of files on ordinary white and black citizens of Mississippi, using their tax dollars to spy on Mississippians and then defame them and plant false news stories about them. There's almost 100 files in the Sovereignty Commission files on Hazel. That's where I found the term, the Female Crusading Scalawag, which is the title of my book. One of her enemies, one of her former friends in Lexington, in a Sovereignty Commission letter said there's not a lot of civil rights activities going on. Why? Because they had crushed it through violence and intimidation. He said, but I'm sad to say that this Female Crusading Scalawag is domiciled in our midst. Okay? This pariah, this cancer on the body politic is here, and if we could just get rid of her, everything would be better. Well, by 1962, she is photographed here in downtown Jackson giving newspapers that she printed for a fee, just a business transaction. She gave copies of the Mississippi Free Press to Medgar Evers. Well, once that it hits the fan, her enemies send copies of the photographs and the reports to every legislator in the state of Mississippi. And on the House floor, in the fall of 1962, a representative from Holmes County basically says, this is what we've been talking about the whole time. This is why we can't stand her. Look at what she's doing. She's promoting integration. She's promoting civil rights. And we're not for that. And we used to be proud of her, but we're not proud of her anymore. Well, if you know anything about Hazel, she turned around and wrote editorials saying, you guys are full of it. And, we need to move into the 20th century, for God's sake. The rest of the country is, why won't Mississippi do that? To give you an examples of why she was so important, by 1962, the first group of African Americans tried to register to vote in April of 1962. They were called the First 14 because it was 14 poor farmers from the small black community of Milestone tried to register to vote. The first guy to go into the courthouse is asked questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? How many hairs are on the back of a donkey? And of course he fails the test to vote. Well, a month later, some white night riders threw Molotov cocktails through his front window and tried to burn his house down. Well, Hartman Turnbow came out blasting with his own gun and he drove off these night riders. The sheriff of Holmes County shows up and arrests him and SNCC workers for burning pennies on the house. Hazel writes editorials where she basically says their only crime is their wanting to vote. So when civil rights atrocities happened from 60, 61, well into the 70s, Hazel was putting it either in an editorial or on the front page. This is what's happening in Mississippi. When James Meredith tries to integrate Ole Miss in 1962, the Holmes County Herald says, here's an example of federal tyranny. Hazel will say, here is an example of the stupidity of Jim Crow racism. Okay? When the three civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, were murdered, she writes editorials where she will say things like, if these young men are found murdered, God will never forgive the state of Mississippi. When Medgar Evers is murdered in 1963, she writes this long, glowing editorial and basically says, he's the best of us. God help us if we can't bring his murderers to justice. So those are the kinds of things she said. African Americans took notice of that. All through the book, and I just don't have the time, about to run out of time here. African Americans all through her career in the 1960s will say, she is one of us. She is standing for us. Dr. Gilbert Mason, if you haven't read his biography about the weigh-ins on the Gulf Coast in the late 50s and 60s, will say he loved Hazel because she didn't take crap off of him. And he said he gave her hope that white Mississippians could change, because if you got a white journalist who was standing up for black civil rights in Mississippi in 1965, there was hope for Mississippi. That is her standing, that is the courthouse of Lexington right behind her. That is her standing in front of her paper in, I believe, 1965 was a picture taken for a Look magazine editorial. By this time, she would be about 50, 51 by this point. There was a journalistic scholar named Susan Wheel who wrote a book in a madhouse den where she looked at Mississippi journalists in the 60s and how they covered the civil rights movement. And she also wrote an article called Hazel and Hacksaw, where she talked about Hazel and Hacksaw Mary King of the Sun and Sun. And she said, and she looked at 4 events, the Freedom Summer, Ole Miss, and a couple of others, from 62 to 64, and she did a statistical analysis of how these newspapers covered these issues. And she made the argument that Hazel was only a handful, maybe 5 or less, of Mississippi editors across the state who covered these events and said, these are murders, this is wrong, and she was the only woman of all the female editors in the state to stand up for civil rights. I've got a couple of minutes left, so let me try to wrap this up. Most of the civil rights promoting editors in Mississippi either died or had left the state by 1970. What made Hazel unique was that she was writing editorials throughout the 1970s and the early 80s. Now, why is that unique? Because by the mid-1970s in Holmes County, African Americans, because they could vote, were starting to vote for African American sheriffs, superintendents of education, school board officials, aldermen in local towns, and things of that nature. Robert Clark, who I hope we all know, was the first African American elected to the Mississippi House of Representatives since the 1890s. He was elected in 1967. Would be an ally of Hazel, but he said that by the late 70s, Hazel couldn't escape the paternalism that she grew up with, telling black people how to do things. And he said that when African Americans are leading the politics of Holmes County, she weighed in and criticized African American leaders like she criticized white leaders before. And she had a falling out over time, not with a lot of her allies from the 60s, but a lot of young African Americans who really didn't know who she was. And so by 1980, my last full chapter deals with how, and by 1980, she's in a no man's land. She was never forgiven by most of the white establishment, and a lot of the younger African Americans just saw her as a part of the establishment, just an old white lady that's telling us what to do. She's deep in debt. Her husband falls involved in an accident in 1982. She makes some really bad business decisions. By 1985, she was succumbing to dementia. Her papers are foreclosed on. Her family takes her back to Alabama. She ends up dying indigent, penniless, in a nursing home run by her niece in Cleveland, Tennessee in 1994. A movie was made about her. Jane Seymour made a movie about her and didn't pay her a dime. And she was so far gone mentally by that point she wasn't even aware that the movie was being made. It's not until 2009 that the state legislature of Mississippi, the same one that condemned her in 1962, put forth a resolution praising her in 2009. Why is she important? She's important because she gives you a glimpse of what life was like in Mississippi from the 30s to the 80s for whites, but also, more importantly, African Americans, the things that they underwent. She gives you a great example of what I believe the freedom of the press is about. She gives you an example of what political correctness was, white Southern style, of the 1950s and 60s. And she is as Bill Miner said, if there is a journalist hall of fame, I mean, she's right up there, with the heavyweights. Let me just read you the last paragraph of my book. In an attempt to sum up a person's life, 2 quotes are appropriate. One is from Walter Bruce, a civil rights activist from Durant. When asked to comment on the career and contributions of Hazel Brannon Smith, Bruce simply replied, he replied, Hazel Brannon Smith was a part of the movement. I don't think she could have put no more in than she did. The other is from a 1971 essay penned by Hazel Brannon Smith herself. In a retrospective about what she had gone through in the 1950s and 60s, and a comment on the future of journalism, she wrote, quote, there are already too many jellyfish in the world. We don't need any more in the form of editors, but if the whole world turns against you, and sometimes it may, you still have your own self-respect. And this is my concluding thought. Living in a time of seething racial hatred, Hazel Brannon Smith left her mark as a defender of free speech and ultimately of civil rights.